Welcome everyone. So today we have Giona as our speaker. I'll quickly give a brief intro. So I got a chance to meet Giona at the NetsIX this year at Porto in Portugal. And so we had really good discussions. And that is when Giona actually kindly agreed to be a part of our network seminar series. So Giona is at ETH Zurich, and he mostly works on data-driven analyses, both on the modeling side and also looking at the properties of the data, specifically on the resilience of social organizations to external shocks, and trying to model the temporal and multi-edge network data types. And so he uses tools from a lot of different interfaces of statistical physics, machine learning, and network science. So today we will be talking about how to model multi-edge network data sets using statistical modeling framework. So I will let Giona take the floor, and thank you so much for agreeing to have a chat with us and be on the seminar series.
So thanks, Chakresh, for the introduction. I'm very happy to join the seminar series. As you said, I will be talking about multi-edge networks and possible ways to model them. And I think the best way is to start with what are multi-edge networks. In a sense, I mean, it's generally obvious what multi-edge networks are, but I thought it was important to go a little bit into the details. So a multi-edge network is simply a network where one or more edges can be incident to the same pair of vertices. So it simply means that between two vertices, there's possibly different edges, and these can come from various different reasons. Usually multi-edge networks are either studied by flattening down to simple graphs, like the one above in the slide here, or they are flattening down to weighted networks. However, for the sake of the discussion today, I would argue that weighted networks are more than simple multi-edge networks, because weighted networks means that edges have an attribute. This attribute can be a number, can be an integer number, like could be a count, but can also be much more. So in general, I think that when we model network, we should always start from simple graphs. We should move to multi-edge graphs and then move to weighted graphs, in the sense that also multi-edge network can have weights, and every different edge in a multi-edge network can have different weights. So this short introduction is simply to say that weights are more than edges, and very often we model as weights multi-edges when we should simply look at different edges, different type of edges between nodes that all have the same weight. So this said, where can we find multi-edge networks? They are actually very abundant when we study network data. So they usually come from collections of repeated interactions between different nodes. Examples are face-to-face interaction networks, like the one of the social patterns or the reality mining experiments and studies. They can come from communication networks, where edges are emails, edges are phone communications, or things like that. They can come from, yeah.
Sorry to cut you. I don't know if you're changing slides, but right now we're just seeing the first slide.
Okay, let's see. Do you see a new slide?
No, no.
Okay, let's stop and start again.
Yes, I don't know. I don't know why. But I think it might be when you. Oh yeah, now we see. Can you try to switch slides just to see? Oh yeah, now it works. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Now it works.
Okay. So no idea what happened. So yeah, other types of multi-edge networks can be ecological and biological interactions, where scientists just count the number of times some animals or plants interact, or number of ways animals or plants interacts. And then we have various cases where the multi-edge network arises from a projection of some kind. Very commonly, we have projections of bipartite networks. For example, in scientometric studies, the citation network between different scientists is a bipartite network originally, where we have scientists to papers or papers to scientists. The paper cites different scientists. And then when we project this down to scientist, we have a scientist that cites another scientist. And because of the nature of the data, we can have multiple citation coming from the same person to another person. And another case are temporal networks, like these face-to-face interactions I mentioned earlier, which they are in principle distributed over time, these interactions, but when the temporal data is either non-available or someone doesn't want to use it in their study, they get flattened down and aggregated, giving a multi-edge network. So in this talk, I will consider simple multi-edge graphs. I will not care about weights on the multi-edges. And I will show a little bit how these can be modeled using a modeling framework that we have developed here at the Chair of System Design. So the first step is to find a broader perspective to look into multi-edges. And the most common one is to look at multi-edges as a process that arises from the wiring of stubs. So this is a classical example in the configuration model, where we have nodes that have a stub that's defined in most cases by their degree. And by rewiring stubs uniformly at random, we generate different realization from a multi-edge network model, as there's no constraint on the fact that the node will connect to another node more than once. So this is more or less the idea that I will follow. And we can look from the perspective of a probability. So we can look at what it means from the perspective of a node. And basically the probability that a node, for example, a node A, will create an edge to either node B, C, or D, once we are thinking in terms of stubs, depends on the abundance of stubs that the nodes to which it needs to connect have. For example, here we have that node B has 3 stubs, node C 2, and node D 1. So if we take a uniformly at random sampling of stubs, node A will create a link more likely to node B, so that's 3 times more likely to node B than to node D, and 3/2 times more likely to node B than to node C. So in other words, the stubs define the maximum number of ways 2 nodes can be connected with an edge, if we take this perspective, because node A has only one stub coming out of it, so there's only one way it can connect to any of the others. And at the same time, node B has 3 stubs coming in, so the maximum number of edges that it will be able to get is only 3. Now, if we take this further, we can try to formalize, to basically give a framework in which we can model multi-edge networks in terms of stubs, in a way that allows us then to do statistical inference, and that allows us to encode hypotheses about networks, and that allows us to study networks in general. So we developed what we call the hypergeometric ensemble. The idea is to map the multi-edge network problem that I was talking about earlier to an ERN problem. So if we are looking at the multi-edge probability that we had before, we had that node A could connect to node B in 3 different ways, to node C in 2 different ways, and to node D into 1 different way. So this means that we could place these edges, these possible edges, in an ERN. And this would generate the ERN that I'm plotting here in the slide on the right side, where we have 3 balls that represent the edge AB, 2 balls that represent the edge AC, and 1 ball that represents the edge AD. And so each pair of nodes is represented by unique color, and the ERN contains as many possible edges as are defined for every pair of nodes. And the process of generating a realization from this network model is simply to sample the edges that we want to pick without replacement, because we don't want to repeat them, out of all the capital M possible edges that we have. And for simplicity and for later, I will define the number of possible edges that there are between any pair as xi ij. And this will basically be the first thing that we need to define when we want to formulate this kind of model. So if that's the process, we're talking about the sampling without replacement from an urn of a given size, then we simply have that the probability to observe a network, so to pick exactly m edges from this urn, is given by the multivariate hypergeometric distribution. So we have a closed form for a model that's completely defined by the number of possible edges that we have for every pair, and that allows us basically to specify different configurations similarly to a configuration model that defines the abundance of the stubs or the abundance of the possible edges that there are for the different nodes and for the different pairs in a way that then allows us to also generate networks, since it's fairly easy to generate realizations from a closed form probability distribution. Now, the issue here is how do we construct this number of possible edges? There's multiple ways. The most trivial way is when the number of possible edges is given to us. And this is something that can happen very often, because there's cases, if we go back to the example I made earlier about the citation networks between scientists, the number of possible edges that there can exist between two scientists is simply given by the number of papers that an author A has written times the number of edges that an author B has written, because an author A can only cite another paper, so a paper can only cite another paper one time. And this means that if an author has written only one paper, he will only be able to cite an author that has written 3 papers 3 times, so 1 for every paper, and possibly can also cite it 0 times. So if we think again of the example that I had before, you can see here on the right that node A could cite node B, so scientist A could cite scientist B on 3 different papers, and it does only on 1, could cite scientist D on only 1 paper because scientist D only wrote on 1 paper, but he never cited, and the same for node C. So basically we can generate realizations, and we can also compute the probability of observing a given network according to this model based on these assumptions. Now, another type of networks where we have very explicitly given the number of possible edges are networks like parliamentary co-sponsorship networks. I don't know if anyone in the audience is familiar with them, but these are basically in some type of political systems like the US one or the Swiss one, members of the parliament propose bills to the parliament to get them approved. And when they do so, they need to gather signatures so that this bill gets more weight and then gets it can go through the process. Chakras, you have a question?
So Giona, there was a question from the chats. So Liva, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, just was a confirmation, if we understand correctly, that the idea here is to just encode with some sort of matrix representation these possible edges, but it may not correspond to any, like you want to build one-to-one correspondence, right? To encode this multiple edges.
So the matrix, this matrix I encodes the number of possible edges that there could be in the network. In some case, it's very explicit or it's connected to reality in the sense that this number is given. That's the case, for example, for citations. And then in the process of sampling, if we sample 0 edges, we will not have any citation. If we sample 1,000 of edges, we will basically saturate the network and assume that everyone cites everyone else. Now, obviously, these models are not realistic. So that's going to be the next step, is how to make them realistic. But this defines the probability space, because once we're talking about multi-edge models, the probability space becomes very important, because if you fix the number of edges, or if you not fix the number of edges, you change in a radical way the size of your probability space. If you think of simple graphs, the graph is either empty or fully connected. And that's a relatively small space, sample space for the networks. But if you think of a multi-edge network, even if we fix the expected number of edges, in principle, we could have infinite edges or 0 edges in the network. So our probability space becomes huge. And this makes it hard to treat it computationally in some cases, but in other cases, simply makes it very hard to do model selection because difference between models then are given at the same time from the differences in the probability space and differences in the model itself. So basically what we're interested can be hidden a little bit by the fact that the probability space is very large. Mm-hmm. So basically what we propose with this framework is to try to more or less reduce the probability space whenever possible. Obviously, this may not always be possible, but to reduce it to only look at networks where the maximum number of possible edges is known. And in some cases, this is not known, obviously. And then if you want to still use this kind of framework, you can go like you usually do with a configuration model where the number of edges, basically the possible ways to connect to nodes, is simply given by the out degree times the in degree. And this gives you all the combinatorial ways to connect to nodes, because I can rewire my stub to the existing stub only as many times as there's other stubs in the network. So this is a way to basically still reduce the probability, fix the probability space in a controlled way, but where we do not know the maximum number of edges a priori. Does this answer your question?
Yeah. Between the corresponding possible networks, but I think that with confirmation that give, yeah, it's a bit more clear. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe also later I will answer more of the question, and you can tell me if there's something not clear or something stupid. That's also possible. So yeah, basically there's ways to construct these metrics, and the whole reason to construct this is to fix the size of the urn. So we want to know how many balls we have in the urn. Every ball is a possible edge, and then we can pick those that we need from it and look at the probability that this happens. Now, the first thing we can look at is if we define the Xi metric, so this metric of possible edges according to the configuration model, because this is where most people are used to work with. This is a very standard model, is the standard model for degree correction in the modularity computation, in the stochastic block model. Degree correction is hidden in various type of network models to correct for the fact that there is heterogeneity between different nodes. And if we formulate the hypergeometric ensemble with Xi ij defined by k out times k in, we get basically this formula, and then we can quickly check the properties of this network. So we can see that the expected number of edges per pair is simply given by k out times k in divided by m. If you remember the formula for modularity, that's the standard result for the configuration model. So there's nothing weird here. And we can also compute the probability of that a node has a given degree. And we can see that this probability is given by again by a hypergeometric distribution. And we can also check that the expected degree is the degree that we have put in originally. So we are preserving degrees in expectation. So this is a soft configuration model. Is not a hard configuration model like the standard rewiring model. It's closer to the Chung-Lu configuration model or to other soft configuration model that exist. So now we have a configuration model, we know how to construct it, but as we were saying earlier, realizations from this model are completely unrealistic, obviously. Like if we, well, okay. So if we look at the realization from it, it will never represent real life. And the point is that we would like to bias the sampling from this urn to encode community structure, homophily, distance-based preferences of nodes wiring, or whatever patterns that we want to study in a real network. So for example, can we take communities into account? To bias the sampling, we can introduce some dyadic propensities, which define the relative preference of a node I to connect a node J given everything else equal. And these omega ij can encode basically dyadic patterns of interest. So any pattern that can be explained in terms of a relation between I and J can be encoded in this way. For example, if we want to encode the community structure or the block model, what we can do is to define some propensity that a node in the same block of another one will have a higher propensity, alpha greater than 1, to connect than to another node that's in a different block. So in this way, we can basically encode communities. But to be able to do that, we need to encode these propensities into the sampling process, and that's what I'm going to show now. So the generalized hypergeometric ensemble builds on this idea. The equiprobable sampling that we were discussing before, the hypergeometric sampling, assumes that the probability to wire a node to another node, to wire an edge, is simply given by the abundance of stubs that we have. Now, if we go to the, sorry, go back one slide, yes. If we introduce some biases, we may, for example, want to encode the fact that node A is much more likely to connect to node D, irrespectively of the fact that node D has only one stub, and instead is very unlikely to connect to node B because it's, for example, if we're talking about scientists, because B is working in a different field, or because A want to explicitly avoid citing B, or any other thing like that. So what we want to do is basically to change the probability or the likelihood of picking a ball arbitrarily, and to do this beyond what we would expect from the simply rewiring the stubs. And in terms of an urn problem, this means making some balls larger than others. So we want to have some balls that are easier to pick and some balls that are harder to pick. So we then need to find a probability distribution that describes this process. And luckily for us, the Wallenius non-central hypergeometric distribution is basically a decentralization of the standard hypergeometric distribution that allows to exactly add this kind of propensity to be sampled into the sampling process. So it makes some balls more sticky than others once we are picking, and we then get an easier way to take them out, even though if they're not abundant. This also means that in this kind of model, there is a competition between these propensities and the abundance. So if we have a lot of very small balls and very few large balls, the two effects may cancel out, or one of them can win on the other, depending on the actual parameters. The probability distribution that you can see here, this multivariate, it's also a multivariate distribution, is quite an ugly distribution. As you can see, it keeps the term of the hypergeometric one that encodes the combinatorial part of this process. It means basically that this part of this distribution is driven by all the possible ways that we can pick aij element from the urn. And then it adds the second part, which is a different normalization term, which is basically a modified gamma function that encodes the propensity of sampling a specific pair. So the larger omega ij, the larger will be the weight on the pair ij, and the more likely we will be to sample balls of the color ij. So the more likely we will be to create edges between I and j. And yeah, and then the S omega is simply a normalization term. So now that we have this distribution, we can try to construct some kind of models that can be useful in practice. The first example I would like to talk about is a special case, which is a block constraint configuration model, we called it, where we do exactly what we were mentioning earlier. So we define the propensities of sampling an edge only based on the belonging of a pair to a given block or to a given community. So the expected number of edges per block, according to the Wallenius distribution, is given by the system of equations. And this means that if we then follow this similar approach to that of a stochastic block model, so if we preserve the expected number of edges per block, so we make sure that blocks that have more edges remain larger and blocks that have less edges remain smaller, or sparser, and we can then preserve the block structure in the network, and we can estimate, solving the system of equations, we can estimate what are the propensities that we need that are simply given by the equation here. So basically, if we look at it from the perspective of this maximum number of edges that I was giving earlier, it's telling us that the propensity of a block depends on the number of edges that we have in a given block divided by the total number of edges that were possibly existing there. So if there's a lot of edges, or very close to the number of edges that we have, that we were maximally possible to have, we will have a large propensity. And if we have a very low number of edges, we will tend to have a very low propensity of picking these balls. So we can look at, I think I've lost, well, I wanted to show a slide before that I've lost. Let me quickly go back to that. If we look at Karate Club, like everyone knows the Karate Club, but we have this very stupid network with two main communities. And if we take a random realization from the configuration models, we lose obviously completely the structure. We get a blob of high degree nodes all connected together. The configuration model tends to have a very high assortativity for high degree nodes. And we basically cannot distinguish any structure anymore. If we now take a realization from the block constraint configuration model, we can see that we still have non-structured graph, since we don't have put anything that could create a structure, but we now clearly separate the two parts of the network. We have the two blocks nicely separated. We can see that some of the high degree nodes are connected between themselves within these two separate blocks, but we don't have anymore these huge connections that we were seeing in the general case. That's quite trivial. Now, we also see that what's missing to model properly the network is, for example, the fact that in the real network, there's very few nodes that are connected across blocks, while here we have a large number of nodes that are expected to connect with few edges across the different blocks. So we clearly need more ingredients to get a realistic model. And that's the aim of the next step, where we can basically add a plethora of variables of interest that are helpful to explain a network. So in the general case, when we study a network, we want to use a collection of explanatory variables. Usually we have one specific variable of interest that encodes some hypotheses that we have about our system. And then we have a large number of control variables that can be endogenous and exogenous effects that we need to control for, so that our estimate for the variable of interest is helpful. And how can we encode these explanatory variables in a gHype? We can use the fact that the ratio between two propensity values, so omega ij and omega ik, describes the odds of I connected to j instead of connecting to k. So we can use this to build a model that's similar to a logistic regression, where we specify the model in terms of log odds. And in this case, then the log of omega ij can be phrased in terms of some parameter theta times the log of the variable of interest that we have and that we are studying, plus the parameters times all the different effects we want to include. And what we need then is that all our variable of interest needs to be written down as a dyadic property, and then the parameter, once we estimate them, and we can do so by maximum likelihood, they will tell us the strength of the effect that these different variables have on explaining the multi-edge network that we are studying. So the first step is to construct an exogenous predictor. So how can we construct these different variables of interest? In the simplest case, we have additional data available on the network that can be mapped to an adjacency metric. So we have distances between nodes, we have friendship links between individuals, we have clusters or grouping of nodes. So we have properties that can be easily mapped to either block matrices or can be mapped to adjacency matrices. And we can simply then put these into the model I've shown before. So basically we can just add these as predictors, as values for the omega ij. And in general, this means that we basically construct some kind of multiplex network where we have the the elf layer of this multiplex network is an adjacency matrix that gives us the values for our predictor, and we can then plug it into our fitting model. However, in some cases, we have endogenous effects that we want to model. So endogenous effects are effects that are not directly given, or not just external sources of data, but in networks are things like triadic closure, homophily, or reciprocity. So things that depend on the network itself. And the trick to do that, to map them to this multiplex representation, is to use change statistics, which were introduced originally for the ERGM's models, which basically is an edge-based approach to measure endogenous effects. It gives adjacency metrics that holds values of endogenous network statistics for each dyad, and we can then put these into the framework. And I will give now just a quick example of what is a change statistic for triadic closure, just to have an idea of how it works. It is quite trivial in practice, and it requires us to compute the weighted shared partner statistics between two nodes to encode the shared partner statistics metrics. The idea is that if we want to compute the shared partner between node A and node B, we forget about basically the edge AB. We don't care about that. And then we look at the number of triangles that an edge AB would close. So the node A and B have two neighbors, they're C and D, and they're, in both cases, they're connected to multiple edges with them. Here I use the weighted representation for simplicity. And adding an edge AB would close, for example, 4 triangles between ABC, because we have minimally 4 edges between B and C, and 6 between A and C. So an edge between A and B can close maximally 4 triangles, and an edge between A and B can close, with a similar reasoning, maximally 5 triangles between A, D, and B. So this means that we have 9 values, basically a value of 9 for the weighted shared partner statistics. It means that adding an edge between A, B closes a lot of triangles. If there is triadic closure, we would expect a high effect for this predictor. And we can do so for every pair in the network. Now, it's approximately 30 minutes that I've been annoying you with this. So now comes something a bit more fun, maybe. This theoretical framework is easy to implement, and we provide an open access implementation for R in the library gHyperNet. This allows us to fit gHype model, it allows to perform multi-edge network regressions, allows to generate efficiently random realizations, and it's also scalable up to a point, so to some 10,000s of nodes and millions of edges. It's not scalable to millions of nodes in the current implementation, but it is practical for many of the data sets that one can study with a network approach. And the good thing is that the implementation is based on our base and our stat functions, so it's easy to work with it together with other tools, with standard R tools, and integrates well with iGraph and the other statistical libraries. So we aimed at something that was possible. It was not just completely standalone, but could integrate in some general works. And so I will show now a couple of examples where we use this. And I will also look a little bit into how we can get these results. So the first example I want to talk about is the Swiss co-sponsorship network. The reason for this is because in this case, we have a very well-defined Xi matrix, and I thought it was interesting to look into that. And because this kind of network really fit the modeling framework that gHy provides. So the co-sponsorship network consists of parliamentary members in a government, in this case, in the Swiss parliament, and these people can sign each other's bills to give a push towards making a bill become a law. So the hypothesis here is that the co-sponsorship signature is a social signal as well as a political signal of support between two different members. And for this specific study, we have two legislation from 2007 to 2015 that corresponds to 321 unique MPs. And we have 90,000 approximately co-sponsorship signatures between these. These are directed edges, and that these constructs our interaction layer in that multiplex network we were talking about before. So that's basically the network we want to study. We have 11 parties. They can be seen in the figures on the right. We know the canton of origin, we have gender, so we have a bunch of control variables, and then we have some endogenous effects that are usually used to study political network, to study political support. And our hypothesis relates to the fact that we also have some online support that these MPs expressed on the PolitNets platform. This was a Swiss website that was active in that period, where different MPs could give each other support, and there was discussions on this platform. And our question was whether this online behavior was at all a proxy for the offline political support, so for the legislative support, or in other words, whether studying the way these people behaved online would tell us anything about how they behave offline, or whether we should only study the offline part. And what we did a large network model where we incorporated the online support variable in terms of similarity of people that supported them to maximize the use of the data that we have. And then we had some endogenous variable, the reciprocity, the shared partner statistics, the number of shared committees between these different MPs. We had some homophily, since there's theories that say that there is a gender and age homophily in the way these co-sponsorship signatures are given. And then we have some correction factors that make sure that our estimates are unbiased. And what we find is that the model, basically in this model, we see that the online support similarity goes very close to zero. So what we can see is that most of the explaining power is loaded to mainly in this case, to the party homophily. So MPs tend to have a behavior that is partially explained by this online support, but is the same explanation that we would get by simply encoding party as a predictor variable. So in practice, what we find is that the online data is interesting in some terms, but people online behave in a very in a way that's not as rich as the way they have offline. While offline, people do more than simply following party lines or basically supporting members of the same party. They also support members of different parties. They have a behavior that's richer and that cannot be simply explained by using these simple variables. So to summarize basically the result, the odds of I co-sponsoring J, if the online support similarity grows from negligible to moderate, increases the factor of, so increases the probability of co-sponsoring only by a factor of 1.07. So basically online support is not particularly meaningful for this study. Now, the second case study I want to show is instead from contacts between students. This is the data set here comes from the social pattern project, where they recorded high school contacts between 320 students over 5 days, and they recorded approximately 200,000 active contacts at 20 seconds intervals. They also recorded class membership that can be seen in the colors in the plot. They recorded topic grouping of the different classes. They recorded gender. And interestingly, they reported friendship relations self-reported by the students and Facebook connection that they got from the Facebook accounts of the different people. So the friendship relations, since they're self-reported, are directed, while the Facebook connection are undirected. And the contacts obviously are undirected. So what we can look at is how much these effects explain the observed interactions and whether they serve any purpose in explaining the way people interact. So, or in other words, do people that claim to be friends interact more in class, or they have, this has nothing to do with it. And before showing you the final result, we can look quickly into the code on how to do that. So I need to quit this sharing and share this. Can you see my screen?
But I think there is some problem at Mark's end. But we can see the screen, Giona, but would it be possible to zoom in a little bit so that
Yeah. Let me try quickly. So
yes.
better?
Yep.
Okay. So this tutorial, I will also make it available online if someone's interested. It can be found on my GitHub account. And the idea here, I will go basically to the interesting bits. So we load the gHyperNet package, and then we load the data directly from the social patterns website, so we can get the data from there. What we get is an edge list with the contacts. We get some metadata about classes and gender. We get the edge list for the Facebook layer, and we get the edges for the friendship layer. And these are all edge lists. So then what we can do, we can construct the adjacency metrics, and we can construct the friendship metrics and the Facebook metrics. These basically have just the number of edges, number of contacts for the adjacency metric between the students, and then whether there is or not a Facebook link between the two students, and whether a student has claimed that the other student is a friend of him or not. So we have these three macroscopic predictors. And then we can construct our predictors to use into that into the gHype module. So for the friendship, we make it an undirected network, because as we were as I was saying earlier, this is directed while the contacts are undirected. So the way that we can do it is simply to take the to basically look at all those that are in both, that are reciprocated. So that's the way I'm proposing to do it here. So if friendship is a friendship only if both people think it is a friendship, and then we can keep the track of those that are not reciprocated in a second predictor. So we can split these directionality into two undirected networks. And then we can do something similar for the Facebook predictor. Simply, in this case, we need to make sure that we take we take off all those people that did not give access to the Facebook platform to the researchers. Some students did not allow them to see it. So we create a second predictor that basically creates us a baseline for not being on Facebook, so that we correct for that. And now that we have our predictor, the first step, we can create some baseline models. For example, we can create a soft configuration model, the one I was showing in the beginning. This is the hypergeometric model. We simply pass the adjacency metric, we state whether it's directed, and self loops, in this case, it's true or false, and the function SCM for soft configuration models return us a gHype model that has 327 vertices, 180,000 edges, and it tells us what's the log likelihood of this model. And then we should have that all the other models improves on this log likelihood, obviously. Another baseline model we can construct is the block model. This can also be constructed in a similar fashion. We specify the adjacency metrics. We specify the labels for the blocks. These are given in the metadata. And in this case, I'm creating a different block for every class. So on the diagonal of this block metrics, we would have the different classes. And then on the cross diagonals, we have all combinations of classes. And in general, we should expect, since students are confined into their classes for most of the times, we should expect the student interact more often in their own class than with different classes. And this can be seen in the output here. So as we can see, this got much smaller already, is half. So the log likelihood went up, basically. And what we can see in the output are the different coefficients. So for example, this is this biology 1 class. So students in the biology 1 class are have a coefficient of 0.65 to interact, compared to, for example, student from the biology 1 to biology 2 that is 0.01. So there's nearly 6 times more likely to interact with students of the same class than for different classes. This is just a way to read this table. We could also specify that we want to have only class homophily, then we would only have 2 blocks, basically being in the same class, whatever that is, and being with other classes. And this would have give us a more concise table of values, but a bit less rich model. And then we can construct the network regression models. We can do that by using the NRM function, so network regression. And what we do, we specify the predictors that we want to have. For now, we haven't got the time to write these in terms of for our formulas. If for those of you that are familiar with statistics in R, there's this formula system that's particularly helpful. Here we need to define them with lists for now. But here we specify the friendship predictor. Basically, this consists of being friend or being half friend, as I was saying earlier. Then we have the adjacency metrics. Again, we specify self loops and directed, and we can also pass some initialization value for the maximum likelihood algorithm to speed it up if we know them or if it gets stuck somewhere. In this case, I have put them a posteriori the right value so that this code runs quite fast. And what we can see is that in this case, the friendship value is 3, the coefficient. This means that if we look at if you remember the formula I showed earlier, this is the log odds of connecting a friend instead of connecting a non-friend. So the log odds are 3 times more likely than than for friends and non-friends. So it looks like that there is some effect. And then we can do this for all the predictors that we have. I think I will not go through all things. I can quickly go back to the to my slides just to conclude the presentation. Do you see the slides? Good. So then what we can do, we can basically compute all these different models, and we can construct a table with all the coefficients, like with the standard regression. We can look at all the different things that we have. Here I've created 3 models. They all have some control factors, which are the class membership, topic membership, gender, homophily, and shared partner statistics. Like we can expect the students then to close triangles in terms, because if I am friend to you and you're friend with someone else, there's a chance that the other 2 are also friends. So we can have these control terms, and then we can look at the friendship effect. And once we add the control term, we see that, for example, the friendship still has a positive and significant value, while the half friends has a negative, small negative value. So it looks like there's even people don't like each other. We can also look at the Facebook layer. It looks like that being friends on Facebook has some effect, but this is very similar to also having no data to our baseline effect. So it also looks like that Facebook is not really a thing, that being friends on Facebook doesn't mean much in terms of the way these students interact. And if we put all the things together, we still get a significant value for the friendship. We get a non-significant value for the half friendship. That's, I think, interesting. And we get also a non-significant value for the Facebook layer. That basically means that if you have real friendships, in the sense that students tell you with whom they're friends, the fact that they're friends on Facebook or not is completely irrelevant. And so basically we can use this model to understand, to try to explain a little bit how we see why multi-edges are there, basically how the people behaves, and we can encode rich type of predictors in this type of models. So this concludes my talk. I think there is time. I left enough time for questions, hopefully. You can find most of the references for our works on the generalized hypergeometric ensemble on either our group website, that's sg.ethz.ch, or on ghyper.net, where there's basically also the vignettes for the implementation and some tutorials and some material. So thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks a lot.